The office was a place of tension, whispers, and unspoken rules. For nearly 30 years, James had given his all to the company, showing up early, staying late, and never once complaining about the grueling hours. He'd become a respected figure within the firm, an integral part of the team. But as the days rolled on, something was changing in the air. James could feel it. The subtle shifts in attitude, the way people looked at him a little differently, the shift in conversations when he walked into a room. He had always worked hard, but now, with just a few more years to retirement, it felt like he was being quietly pushed aside. But why? At the center of it all was Robert, the company's boss. Charismatic, sharp, and with a reputation for getting things done, Robert had made it clear to everyone that he believed in hard work and loyalty. But James, who had given decades of his life to the company, was starting to wonder if Robert truly believed in those things or if there was something more sinister at play. It was the kind of office where you knew your place, and James knew his. He had earned his position, though as the years went by, something in the way Robert ran things seemed to change. The praise became scarce. Opportunities for advancement seemed to dry up. The dismissive looks and the cold shoulder grew more frequent. James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He couldn't understand it, until one afternoon, when Robert called him into his office. The conversation that followed was a blur. James, shocked and stunned, barely heard Robert's words as they echoed in his head. "James, we're letting you go." Those words hit him like a freight train. His heart sank, his chest tightened. After everything, all those years of loyal service, Robert was letting him go? And just months away from retirement? The betrayal stung in a way he hadn't anticipated. As James tried to process the shock, Robert's reasons seemed more like excuses than explanations. He spoke about company restructuring and new directions. But to James, the true meaning of those words was painfully clear. The final blow hit harder than anything else: the look in Robert's eyes. It wasn't about business, it was personal. The next few weeks were a blur of emotions. James struggled to make sense of it all. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers seemed to avoid the topic. The humiliation of being fired so close to retirement, when he'd given his entire life to this job, was more than he could bear. But he wasn't about to give up. James knew that if he didn't take a stand, the injustice would go unnoticed. It would fade into the shadows as if it were just another corporate decision, another casualty of business. But as James wrestled with his next steps, little did he know, Robert's decision was going to come with consequences that neither of them could ever have imagined. And those consequences were about to tear apart everything Robert had worked so hard to build. Just days after firing James, Robert started to notice things weren't going as planned. Employees who had once been loyal were now questioning his leadership. The board, which had always been on his side, began to murmur. Whispers of discontent spread like wildfire. His cold and calculated decision was now beginning to backfire in ways he couldn't control. And yet, Robert remained confident, until the unthinkable happened. The phone call that changed everything came one evening, long after the office had emptied. Robert was alone in his office, feeling a rare moment of peace. But then the call came in. The voice on the other end was stern and unfamiliar, a voice that would force Robert to face the very consequences of his actions. "Mr. Robert, we need to talk." The words sent a shiver down his spine. What was going on? What had he done? And who was behind this sudden shift in his world? As the story unfolds, it becomes clear that things were about to get much worse for Robert. The consequences of firing James, a decision he thought was final, were only just beginning. But what was the price that Robert would have to pay? And would he realize the gravity of his actions before it was too late? Stay tuned, because the fallout from this decision is far from over. Robert sat in his office, staring at the phone as if it were a foreign object. It had been a long time since he'd felt this uneasy. The weight of his decision, the firing of James, was sinking in, but it was far from the quiet relief he had expected. The months of stress, pressure, and constant demands from the company's upper management had led him to make the call, but now that it was done, Robert was beginning to question if it was the right one. He had been the boss for years, confident in his decisions and always able to justify them with cold logic. But this felt different. For the first time in a long time, Robert had a nagging feeling that something was slipping from his grasp. He grabbed the phone and dialed the number, trying to steady his nerves. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but there was an edge to it that made Robert's stomach turn. "Mr. Robert," the voice said again, "I need you to listen carefully. You've made a mistake, and it's going to cost you more than you think." Robert's brow furrowed, a cold chill creeping up his spine. He wasn't used to being talked to like this. He was the one who gave orders, who made the rules. But this voice, this stranger, was making him feel like he was on the other side of the table for the first time in his life. "What do you mean?" Robert tried to steady his voice, though it cracked slightly. "What mistake? You know what I'm talking about. Firing James. You thought you were in control, but you've underestimated the consequences." A tense silence hung in the air. Robert leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the armrest as he processed the words. James had been a loyal employee for nearly 3 decades, yes. But was that enough to keep him around when the company was going through changes? When there were new goals to meet and fresh ideas to explore? Robert had convinced himself it was for the best, but now the weight of his decision was becoming undeniable. "What do you want?" Robert asked, his voice now laced with suspicion. "We'll be in touch," the voice replied, before abruptly hanging up. Robert sat in stunned silence. The phone call left him more rattled than he cared to admit. Who was that? And how did they know so much about his decision? He had thought that firing James would be a clean break, that it would make the company run more efficiently. But now, it felt like he had set something in motion, something that was spiraling out of his control. Meanwhile, James had his own worries. The shock of the firing was still fresh, but it was quickly being replaced by a burning sense of injustice. The office had been his second home for so long, and now, just when he was about to retire, they were throwing him out like yesterday's news. James knew that the company had changed over the years, but he had always trusted that his hard work would count for something. The days following the firing were a blur. James was caught between anger, confusion, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal. He spent hours pacing around his house, wondering what had gone wrong. He thought back to the years when things were different, the days when he felt respected, when his contributions were acknowledged. He had always believed in the company's mission, in its vision, but now it seemed like all of that was fading away. He had given his entire life to this place, and for what? As the reality of his situation sank in, James knew he couldn't just let it go. He needed answers. He wasn't the kind of man who sat idly by when things weren't right. But he also knew that taking action wouldn't be easy. Robert wasn't the type to back down. He was a man who was used to getting what he wanted, and James had no illusions about the power dynamics at play. But that didn't mean he wasn't going to try. One evening, James reached out to some of his old colleagues, people who had worked with him for years. He hadn't heard from most of them since his firing, and he wasn't sure how they would respond, but it was worth a shot. He needed allies, people who might understand what he was going through. He couldn't be the only one who had noticed the subtle changes around the office, could he? It wasn't long before he heard back from Sarah, one of his former co-workers. She had worked alongside him in the same department for almost 2 decades, and they had always gotten along well. When James shared what had happened, Sarah's voice on the other end of the line was full of sympathy. "I can't believe it, James," she said. "You were the most dedicated person I know. No one saw this coming. And it's not just you. Things have been changing in the office for a while now. People are starting to notice." James's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What's been going on?" "There's been a shift in leadership. Robert's been making some decisions that don't sit right with a lot of people. People are starting to talk, James. They're questioning his methods, his priorities. There's a lot of murmuring behind closed doors." James could feel the tension building in his chest. He had always suspected that something was off, but hearing Sarah confirm it was a revelation. "I think people are starting to see Robert for what he really is," Sarah continued. "He's ruthless, James. He's willing to do whatever it takes to get ahead, even if it means stepping on the people who helped him get there." For the first time since his firing, James felt a spark of hope. Maybe he wasn't alone in this fight. Maybe there were people who understood what he was going through. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to expose Robert for what he truly was. As the conversation continued, Sarah mentioned something that made James's blood run cold. "There's a rumor going around," she said, lowering her voice. "It's about Robert. Something big is coming. Something that could bring everything down." James's curiosity was piqued, but he knew better than to push for details. He needed more information, more proof. If he was going to take on Robert, he needed to be strategic. The last thing he wanted was to make a move too soon, only to find out that it backfired. The following days were filled with a growing sense of unease for both James and Robert. James, determined to uncover the truth, began to gather any information he could. Robert, meanwhile, began to feel the pressure mounting. The consequences of his decision were starting to show their teeth, but neither man knew just how far-reaching the fallout would be. For now, the tension remained thick in the air. Both were walking a dangerous line, and the story was far from over. What would happen next? Would James's pursuit of justice succeed, or would Robert's empire crumble under the weight of his own decisions? Only time would tell, and the clock was ticking. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the office was palpable. Robert could feel it growing, like a storm on the horizon, but he couldn't pinpoint its exact source. The whispers were getting louder, the glances from his employees colder. He had made a clean break, or so he thought, when he fired James. But now, it seemed that decision was unraveling, piece by piece. Robert began to notice things that he hadn't before. The way his employees no longer rushed to speak with him after meetings, how his usual supporters seemed more distant. His assistant, Maria, who had always been the picture of professionalism, now avoided eye contact when handing him documents. It was subtle, but Robert wasn't blind to the change. His grip on the company, on the people who had always looked up to him, was slipping. It wasn't just the employees, the board had started to question his leadership as well. A couple of members had reached out to express concerns over his recent decisions, though they never directly mentioned James. They were more tactful, careful in their approach, but Robert could sense their unease. One of them, Claire, had been a vocal supporter of Robert in the past, but now their conversations were short, almost curt. Every time Robert asked her about the company's performance or strategies, her responses were vague, as if she were holding back something important. There was no doubt in Robert's mind that James's firing had something to do with it. The guilt that had crept into his mind was now turning into full-blown paranoia. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now it felt like he was being watched, judged, as if the very walls of his office were closing in on him. Meanwhile, James was far from sitting idle. His days were spent combing through old files, reviewing anything he could find that might give him an edge. He started to reach out to former colleagues who had left the company, people who might have seen things from a different perspective. It wasn't easy. Most of them had moved on, starting their own businesses or taking jobs in other industries. But James was determined. He wasn't going to let Robert walk away from this without facing the consequences. One evening, James sat down with an old friend, Larry, who had worked with him in the finance department years ago. Larry had left the company after a falling out with Robert over a failed project, and he had never looked back. James hoped that Larry might know something, anything, that could help him understand what was really going on at the top of the company. As they sipped their coffee, Larry leaned in, his voice low. "I've been hearing things, James. And I think I know what's been going on behind closed doors. You weren't the first one he tried to push out, you know. It's a pattern with Robert. He's been cleaning house, getting rid of anyone who doesn't align with his vision." James listened intently, his heart racing. "What do you mean? Who else?" "There was Steven, a few months ago," Larry continued. "He was with the company for almost as long as you were. He was a senior manager, someone Robert couldn't control anymore. You know how Robert is. He needs people who will do exactly what he says, who won't question his decisions. Steven wasn't one of those people, and he ended up being let go too." James's mind was spinning. He had known that Robert was ruthless, but this was on a whole other level. The more Larry spoke, the clearer it became. Robert was building an empire, but it was an empire of fear and manipulation. James's firing wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger, more dangerous pattern. "I'm telling you, James," Larry said, his voice serious now, "Robert's not the man he used to be. He's changed, and I don't think it's just about business anymore. There's something else driving him, something deeper. Something that could take down the whole company." James's thoughts raced. Could Larry be right? What was Robert hiding? It wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about power, control, and something darker that James couldn't quite put his finger on. As James left the coffee shop, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him more than ever. He knew that he couldn't take on Robert alone. He needed more allies, more information. But the more he uncovered, the more it seemed like the whole company was a house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. The next few days were filled with even more uncertainty. James began to hear rumors about Robert's personal life, things he had never known about before. A colleague from years ago had mentioned that Robert had been involved in some shady dealings, questionable investments that could have put the company at risk. It wasn't concrete, but the more James heard, the more he began to piece together a picture of a man who was hiding something much bigger than just a few questionable firings. Robert, for his part, was beginning to feel the pressure like never before. The sense of unease that had been growing in the office was now starting to affect him physically. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't focus. Every time the phone rang, he jumped. Every knock at his door made his heart race. He had always been the one in control, but now he felt like a puppet, the strings being pulled by forces he couldn't understand. One night, Robert sat in his office, going over company reports when the lights flickered. He thought it was nothing, just the building's aging infrastructure, but then the power went out completely. He sat in the dark for a moment, wondering if it was a sign, a warning. A part of him feared that the darkness wasn't just in the building, it was closing in on him, threatening to swallow him whole. And then, the phone rang again. This time, there was no calm voice on the other end. Instead, there was only static, followed by the sound of a voice, distorted, like it was coming through a speaker underwater. "You've made a deal with the devil, Robert. And now, it's time to pay the price." Robert's blood ran cold. The voice was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. Whatever Robert had done, whatever had been set in motion, was far from over. It wasn't just about James anymore. There were bigger forces at play, and Robert was about to find out just how deep the hole went. The tension was mounting, and both Robert and James were being pulled deeper into a web they hadn't yet fully understood. As the days passed, the stakes grew higher, the risks more dangerous. And neither man had any idea just how far-reaching the consequences would be. For now, the pieces were still scattered, the puzzle incomplete. But one thing was certain: the story was far from over. And the reckoning was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. The tension in the office had reached a boiling point. Robert could feel it pressing in on him from every direction: whispers, glances, phone calls, and emails. It was as if everyone was watching him, waiting for him to slip. He had always been the one in control, the one who called the shots, but now, the power he had once wielded so easily felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Every meeting, every decision, now seemed to carry a weight that he wasn't sure he could bear. The shadows of doubt followed him, and he couldn't escape them. His phone rang again, breaking his thoughts, but this time, he didn't hesitate. He picked it up immediately, almost desperate for a distraction. It was Claire, one of his most trusted board members. "Robert, we need to talk," she said, her voice strained. "I know. I can feel it," he replied, trying to keep the edge of panic out of his voice. "I don't know what's going on, but it's like the walls are closing in." "It's more than that," Claire said, her voice low, almost nervous. "There are rumors, Robert. The board's been talking. There's a feeling that things aren't what they seem. People are questioning your leadership, your decisions. And they're starting to dig into your past." Robert's stomach twisted into knots. "What are they saying? Who's digging? What have they found?" "I don't know all the details yet," Claire said, sounding almost apologetic. "But we need to act quickly. Whatever you've been hiding, it's about to come to light. And if it does, everything you've worked for, it will all come crashing down." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Robert sat in stunned silence, the weight of her words sinking in. He had built this empire on lies, manipulation, and ambition. He had pushed out anyone who threatened his control. And now, it seemed like those very people were closing in on him, looking for the cracks in his armor. Meanwhile, James's investigation had taken a darker turn. The more he dug into the company's history, the more he uncovered. Documents, emails, old contracts, all pointing to something much bigger than he had ever anticipated. Robert's dealings weren't just questionable, they were illegal. There were connections to shady investments, embezzlement, and even financial cover-ups that could destroy the entire company. And James had it all. He had the evidence. But as he sat in his small apartment, looking over the files, a cold feeling washed over him. The deeper he went, the more dangerous it became. He had already lost his job, his reputation tarnished by Robert's decision. Now, if he went public with the evidence, it could mean more than just a corporate scandal. It could mean exposing the entire web of corruption that had been carefully hidden for years. And James was beginning to realize that the people Robert had hurt were not just victims. They were powerful, dangerous, and they wouldn't hesitate to protect their secrets at any cost. James knew that he had to act fast. The longer he waited, the more Robert's empire solidified. But the closer he got to the truth, the more perilous the situation became. The phone calls, the strange encounters, the feeling of being watched, it was all starting to make sense. Robert's enemies were out there, and they were already aware of James's search. He had become a target, and he knew it. But what could he do? He couldn't go to the authorities, they were just as corrupt, just as tangled in the lies as everyone else. The two men, each unaware of how close they were to each other's plans, were on a collision course. James's next move was critical. He had to expose the truth, but the consequences of doing so were far greater than he had ever imagined. Robert, on the other hand, had a choice to make, to continue hiding behind his facade or to confront the demons that had been following him for years. Late one night, James received a message, cryptic, simple, and chilling. "You know too much. Stay out of it." It was from an unknown number, but it was clear that someone was warning him to stop. He felt a cold sweat trickle down his spine as he realized that this was no longer just about his job. This was about survival. If he kept going, if he pushed too far, the consequences might be more than he could handle. But then, there was the weight of it all, the injustice of what Robert had done to him, to others. James knew he couldn't let this go. There was something more important than his own safety now, exposing the truth. He couldn't be intimidated into silence. The world needed to know what Robert had done. Robert, meanwhile, was growing more desperate. The walls were closing in faster than he could control. His meetings with the board were becoming more hostile. His assistant, Maria, had begun to ask questions about his decisions, about the things he had been hiding. She was loyal, but even she had started to doubt him. He had relied on people like her, people who trusted him implicitly. Now, he saw that trust starting to fracture, and he knew it wasn't just a matter of bad decisions. It was a matter of time before everything fell apart. Robert's paranoia grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following him. The constant surveillance of his every move seemed unbearable. He started to see shadows in the corners of his eyes, hear footsteps when no one was there. The more he tried to stay focused, the more he realized that his empire was built on lies, and those lies were starting to catch up with him. As the days passed, the sense of impending doom loomed ever closer. The phone calls continued, the threats became more direct, and both men, Robert and James, felt the pressure closing in. The final confrontation was drawing near, but neither knew when it would happen or how it would unfold. Would James's evidence be enough to expose Robert for what he was? Would Robert's hold on the company slip completely, or could he turn the tables one last time? Neither man knew how much longer they could keep up the charade. The air was thick with tension, and the outcome was uncertain. But one thing was clear: the moment of reckoning was coming. And when it did, it would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew. The tension in the air had become unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every unexpected knock at the door, made both Robert and James jump, their nerves on edge. They could feel it, the moment of reckoning drawing closer with each passing second. But neither could have predicted the turn of events that would shift everything. It happened late one evening. Robert was alone in his office, trying to piece together the wreckage of his leadership, when his phone buzzed. The number was unrecognized, but he answered it anyway, desperate for anything that could provide him with some sense of control. "Robert," the voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "I know what you've been hiding." Robert's pulse quickened. It was one thing to be suspicious, but hearing those words from a stranger on the phone made his blood run cold. He instinctively reached for the lock on his desk drawer, where the evidence of his shady dealings was hidden. The room seemed smaller, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on him. "Who is this?" Robert demanded, trying to sound authoritative, though his voice cracked slightly. "You don't need to know my name," the voice replied. "What matters is that I have everything. The files, the contracts, the emails, everything that could destroy you and the company." Robert's mind raced. Could this be someone from his past? A disgruntled former employee? But how did they get so much? He had taken precautions, ensured his secrets were locked away behind layers of protection. "What do you want?" Robert asked, his voice low, a mix of fear and anger. "I want you to make a choice, Robert. The truth comes out. Your company, your reputation, your wealth, all gone. Or, you can take the fall for something much worse. But that's not up to me. It's up to you. Robert gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. What do you mean? What are you saying? Your sins go deeper than you think. And I can prove it. But that's not all. You see, James isn't the only one who's been digging. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Robert's breath caught in his throat. James. Of course. How could he have been so blind? The firing. The investigations. But then, the voice added another line that sent Robert's heart into freefall. You might want to check your board members, Robert. One of them has been feeding James information. They've been playing both sides. Robert's mind spun, trying to grasp the enormity of what the voice was suggesting. A traitor, someone he trusted, someone who sat at the table with him every week, was working against him. That person had been feeding James the very information Robert had worked so hard to bury. The web of lies, the hidden deals, the schemes, it was all falling apart faster than he could control it. His mind raced through the list of names, Claire, Maria, even the people who had always been loyal to him. Who could it be? And why hadn't he seen it before? Before he could respond, the voice on the other end of the line spoke again, its tone chilling. Don't worry, Robert. The board members know everything. They're all in on it. And once they know the truth about your involvement, well, let's just say they'll have no choice but to turn their backs on you. Robert's world tilted. All along, he had been worried about James, about the truth coming out and ruining his empire. But now, it wasn't just James who was a threat. It was the people who had been closest to him, the people he had trusted with his darkest secrets. The betrayal cut deeper than any external threat ever could. Meanwhile, across town, James had been following a lead that was taking him closer to the truth than ever before. He had always suspected there was more to Robert's actions than just corporate greed, but what he had uncovered in the past few days was nothing short of explosive. The papers in his hands, once just another pile of discarded documents, now told a story far more sinister than he had imagined. There were connections to organized crime, secret offshore accounts, and bribery that could bring down not just Robert, but an entire network of powerful figures who had been operating in the shadows for years. James had thought he was the one with the upper hand, the one holding all the cards. But now, he realized just how much he had underestimated the scale of what he was dealing with. This wasn't just about one man's downfall, it was about exposing a system, a corruption so deep that even the people at the highest levels of power were involved. And if he wasn't careful, he could easily become a casualty of it all. But then, just as he was about to make a phone call to Claire, one of the few people who might be able to help him, his phone buzzed. The message was short but sent a wave of cold dread through him. Stop digging. You're too close. James's heart raced. Who was it this time? Who else had found out what he was doing? His hand trembled as he stared at the screen. It was clear that whoever was behind this had far more power than he had anticipated. But there was no turning back now. If he backed down, the truth would never come to light. Robert, his board, and everyone else involved would continue their reign of corruption, and James would have nothing to show for his efforts but a life ruined by their betrayal. As James sat back, contemplating his next move, the stakes had never been higher. It wasn't just about exposing Robert anymore. It was about taking down an entire system, one that had been operating under the radar for years, and now, it was coming after him, trying to silence him before he could get the truth out. Back at Robert's office, his phone buzzed again, and for a moment, he thought it was the voice from before. But this time, it was a different message, one that made his blood run cold. It was from Claire. Robert, I'm sorry. I never wanted it to come to this. I've been helping James. I couldn't live with what we've done. The board's turning against you. They're preparing to vote you out. Robert's mind spun. He had known something wasn't right, but this was a betrayal on a scale he hadn't even considered. He had trusted Claire. She was supposed to be his ally, his confidant. But now, she was the one who was bringing everything down. The walls were closing in on both men. For Robert, the game was changing. It wasn't just about saving his position anymore, it was about survival. And for James, the danger was more real than ever before. As the forces of corruption closed in on him, he could feel the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He had taken the risk, but now the cost was becoming clearer by the second. The time for hesitation was over. One way or another, it was all coming to a head. And neither man could anticipate the shocking events that would unfold in the final moments of their battle. The tension reached its peak in the final hours before the board's crucial vote. Robert knew that this was his last chance to turn things around. His back was against the wall, and every option seemed to lead to more chaos. His mind raced as he paced the room, the weight of betrayal hanging heavy in the air. Claire's message had shattered his sense of security, and the realization that the very people he had trusted were now turning on him was almost too much to bear. He had prepared himself for a confrontation with James, but this was a different kind of battle. This was personal. His company, his reputation, his entire empire were hanging by a thread. He had one last ace up his sleeve. A secret account. A final piece of leverage that no one knew about, one that could buy him the time he needed to escape the downfall that was sure to come. He needed to find a way to make the board believe he still had control. He needed them to see him as the one with the power, the one who could save them from the inevitable collapse. Meanwhile, James had gathered the final pieces of the puzzle. Armed with the damning evidence, he felt more determined than ever. He had spent days carefully assembling everything he had uncovered, the financial records, the emails, the hidden deals, and now, the corruption within the board itself. He had already contacted a journalist who could help him break the story to the public, but something held him back. The threat on his life was no longer a vague warning. It was real. He had already received 2 more anonymous messages, both more threatening than the last, urging him to stay silent or suffer the consequences. But James knew he couldn't back down now. He had to expose everything. The night before the vote, both men were in the eye of the storm. Robert, desperate and cornered, made a last-ditch attempt to secure his future. He had arranged a secret meeting with one of the board members, the one he trusted most, who had been a loyal ally for years. If he could convince this one person to back him, he could sway the vote in his favor. He wasn't ready to give up without a fight. James, on the other hand, had decided to confront Robert directly. He needed answers, and he needed closure. He couldn't let Robert continue to manipulate everyone, especially when he knew the truth. Armed with the evidence in hand, James made his way to Robert's office, prepared to end the reign of deception once and for all. When they finally came face to face, the room seemed to hold its breath. Robert stood behind his desk, his usual arrogance replaced by a nervous energy. James, standing across from him, didn't hesitate. He slammed the folder of evidence down onto the desk, the sound cutting through the silence like a thunderclap. "You thought you could get away with it," James said, his voice steady but full of anger. "You thought I'd be the one to fall. But you were wrong. You're not in control anymore." Robert's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and defiance. "You don't know what you're getting into. You think this is just about me? It's bigger than you can imagine. The people I've worked with, they're not just going to let this happen. You're playing a dangerous game, James." For a moment, it seemed like Robert might try to turn the tables, might make one last desperate attempt to escape. But then, something unexpected happened. James reached into his bag and pulled out a final piece of evidence, a letter from the anonymous source who had been feeding him information all along. The letter wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. And as James read aloud, Robert's face drained of color. "Your empire isn't falling because of me, Robert. It's falling because the people who helped you build it have already turned their backs on you. You've been betrayed, by your own." The letter confirmed everything. The board, the allies Robert had trusted, had been the ones orchestrating his downfall. They had been feeding James the information he needed, yes, but they had also been quietly working behind the scenes to take over the company. Robert wasn't just a victim of James's investigation. He was a victim of his own ambition and the very people who had once supported him. The realization hit Robert like a freight train. His empire, his carefully constructed world, had been a lie all along. The people he thought he could manipulate and control were the ones who had played him. And now, the betrayal was complete. Before Robert could respond, the door to the office opened, and Claire stepped in. Her expression was one of regret, but there was no turning back now. She had been the one who had leaked the information to James. She had been the one to start the chain of events that would now bring everything crashing down. Robert looked at her, his eyes full of disbelief. "I'm sorry," Claire said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't let you do this anymore. You're not the man I thought you were. And I couldn't stand by and watch you destroy everything, including yourself." Robert's knees buckled, and he slumped into his chair, the weight of everything crashing down on him. The empire he had built was no more. The betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, it had all caught up with him in the most unexpected way. And just as it seemed like the story was coming to a close, another twist emerged. As James prepared to call the authorities and make the truth public, he received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was calm, collected, but unmistakable. "James, you're too late," the voice said, sending a chill down his spine. "Everything you think you know is wrong. You've been played, just like Robert. The people you're trusting, they have their own agenda." Before James could respond, the call ended. He stared at his phone, the weight of the words sinking in. It wasn't just Robert who had been hiding secrets, it was everyone. The story was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The forces at play were far more complex than he could have ever imagined, and the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became. The final twist left the audience on the edge of their seats. Who was behind the voice on the phone? Was there another layer to the conspiracy that no one had anticipated? And what would happen next, now that the foundations of everything had been shaken to their core? As the camera zoomed in on James's confused expression, the screen cut to black, leaving the story hanging in suspense. The truth was out there, but the full picture was still a mystery. The game was far from over, and the consequences of their actions would echo far beyond what any of them had ever expected. The silence that followed the mysterious phone call was deafening. James stood frozen, staring at his phone, trying to make sense of the cryptic words. Who was behind that call? And why would they say that he had been played? The more he thought about it, the more he realized just how deep this whole conspiracy ran. Was Robert the only puppet in this game? Or had they all been manipulated by someone even more powerful, someone hidden in the shadows? James had no answers yet, but the weight of uncertainty was unbearable. He had come so far, uncovered so much, and now he was questioning everything. He turned to Claire, who was still standing in the doorway. Her eyes were filled with regret, but also something else, determination. She had chosen her side, and now she was here, ready to face whatever came next. "We need to get to the bottom of this, Claire," James said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I don't care who's behind this. Robert may have been the puppet, but there's someone pulling the strings. And if we don't find out who they are, this will never end." Claire nodded silently, her resolve growing stronger. "We'll find them, James. Together. No more lies. No more secrets. It's time to take this down for good." Robert, still sitting in his chair, looked between them with a mix of anger and defeat. The realization of his own betrayal, not just to his employees, but to himself, had finally settled in. He had spent years building an empire, only to see it crumble in a matter of days. But as the weight of his failures sank in, there was a glimmer of something else, fear. Fear of what would happen next, of the consequences of his actions. "I don't know what you think you're going to do," Robert said, his voice shaky. "You're both in over your heads. You think exposing me will change anything? You've just scratched the surface. There's more to this than you can even imagine. I'm not the only one you should be worried about." But James wasn't listening anymore. He had no interest in Robert's threats. The time for talking was over. It was time to take action. James knew he had to find out who was behind all of this, but he couldn't do it alone. Claire was right. This was bigger than both of them, and if they didn't join forces, the truth might never come to light. James and Claire quickly set out to dig deeper into the network of corruption that had ensnared them all. They began to connect the dots, linking the board members to shady deals, discovering the hidden ties to offshore accounts, and following the trail of suspicious transactions that had been buried for years. It wasn't easy. There were countless dead ends, false leads, and moments of doubt. But with every piece of the puzzle they uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Then, just when they thought they had finally reached the heart of the conspiracy, they made a breakthrough. James received a tip from an anonymous source, someone who had been watching everything unfold from the shadows. The message was brief but precise: "The real mastermind is closer than you think." James felt a chill run down his spine. Who could it be? They were no longer dealing with faceless corporate villains. This was personal now. Someone they knew, someone in their circle, had orchestrated everything. Someone who had been manipulating them all along. But who? The answer came in a way that neither of them could have predicted. The day of the board vote arrived, and everything came to a head. James and Claire made their final preparations, ready to expose the full extent of the corruption to the board. They had everything they needed: evidence, witnesses, and the truth. It was time to turn the tables once and for all. But as they walked into the boardroom, they were met with an unexpected sight. Robert wasn't there. His seat was empty, and the mood in the room was tense, almost foreboding. As the meeting began, Claire whispered to James, "Where's Robert? This doesn't feel right." James nodded, his instincts on high alert. "I don't know, but something's off." Before they could investigate further, a voice rang out from the head of the table. "I'll handle this from here." It was a voice they both knew all too well. It was Claire's mother, Elise, one of the longest-serving board members, the one who had always stayed in the background, appearing calm and collected, never making waves. But now, as she stood in front of them, it was clear that she was the mastermind they had been looking for all along. Elise had been pulling the strings from the beginning, manipulating Robert, the board, and everyone involved to serve her own agenda. "I've been waiting for this moment," Elise said, her voice cold and calculated. "You think you've uncovered the truth, James? You've only scratched the surface of what I've built. Robert was just a pawn, and now that you're here, I can finally put an end to this little game." The room went silent as the board members looked between each other, some confused, others nodding in understanding. It all made sense now. Elise had been the one orchestrating everything from behind the scenes, manipulating not just Robert but everyone involved to secure her power. She had played James, played Claire, and even played Robert. And now, she was ready to take full control. James was stunned. He had never suspected Elise. She had always seemed so harmless, so calm, so loyal. But now, it was clear that she had been the one running the show all along. And in the blink of an eye, everything he had worked for seemed meaningless. "We can stop this, Elise," Claire said, her voice trembling but firm. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to destroy everything." Elise smiled, a cruel, almost triumphant smile. "It's too late for that, my dear. You should have stayed out of it. Now you've seen too much." But before Elise could make her next move, a sudden noise interrupted her, the sound of the doors opening wide. Robert stepped into the room, his face pale but resolute. "You're not the only one who's been playing a game, Elise," Robert said, his voice low. "I knew something was off when I started seeing the pieces fall into place. And now, the truth is coming for all of us." Elise's face twisted in fury as Robert revealed the final piece of the puzzle. He had been working with the authorities, feeding them information all along. The truth was about to come out, and there was no escaping it. With Robert's help, the board members were soon informed of everything: Elise's role in the conspiracy, her manipulation of the entire system. The weight of her betrayal hit everyone hard. Her reign of control crumbled in a matter of hours, and by the end of the day, she was ousted from the company for good. As James and Claire walked away from the boardroom, they knew that they had won. The truth had come to light, and those responsible for the corruption had been exposed. But even as they left the building, they couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with more battles, more struggles, but for the first time, they were on the right side of history. The final lesson was clear: power corrupts, and trust is fragile. But when you stand up for the truth, even in the face of overwhelming odds, you can change the course of your own destiny.